truly an honor to be with all of you this evening, especially with something that is associated with Rabbi Avi West's name. Avi was just such a preeminent educator in this area. So much of what I've come to understand about education has been through the lens that he taught. And so to be able to do this tonight is wonderful honor. And it's also really exciting because, as Matt mentioned, last year when the Yedid Nefesh Haggadah came out, I did something quite uncharacteristic, which is went on the web and immediately ordered copies for me to take to Israel for my family's Seder, and enough copies for the synagogue Seder. The synagogue one was easy because we had been using Maxwell House the previous year. So, or a combination of Maxwell House and Nathan Goldberg's, which both contain everything about the Seder, but not much else there. And I'll share a little bit about why I was so excited about it, and then turn over to Josh to talk about what he was hoping to create in making it. And what really excited me, first of all, having been very familiar with the Yedid Nefesh venture, I knew the quality of the scholarship was going to be great. Second of all, I knew that the language in terms of being an egalitarian, having transliteration, so making it accessible was great. And third, and very importantly, the size. Right? I think a lot of people who create Haggadot forget that it's supposed to be used at a dinner table, and they make these huge Haggadot, right, that are unwieldy. And this one works very nicely. I can tell you from last year's experience, it worked extremely well at the table without knocking over everybody's glasses of wine and water. And there's so much that is interesting inside of the Haggadah as well, in terms of its commentary, its artwork, and we'll have a chance to explore that. But Josh, with all of the Haggadot, those are the things that I was excited about. With all the Haggadot that are out there, what was it that made you want to create another one?
So first of all, thank you so much for having me, and it's really great to be able to be a part of this and to be at the Haberman Institute. I first want to say that I just wanted there to be more Haggadahs in the world. That's actually not true. I actually hesitated I had the project in mind for a few years before I really sort of committed to sort of doing it and seeing it through, precisely because there's so many Haggadot out there, and because I wasn't coming to it from a place of feeling like I had a particular take on the story that I needed to, or a particular commentary to write that I needed to share. It's much more that over the years, I would ask friends, those who have a whole set of a certain, like what they use. And for all of them, so many Haggadot out there, the answers tended to be a very, very short list. And there are people who had sets of kids Haggadot and then graduate and then sort of like are ready to move on from them. There are people who, for a certain number of years, used one of the very sort of like one of the Haggadah crammed with activities and and skits and readings and poems and songs. A different night is I think by far the most widespread, which my family also used for a number of years, and it is both I find it it's been a wonderful resource, and it's very big, and very big pages with often a very small amount of text, and places where you're flipping through several pages just to find the next little piece of Haggadah text. So a lot of people, certainly that I know, like after a certain number of years of using one of those kind of like very chock full Haggadot, and wanted to get back to sort of being able to focus on the Haggadah liturgy, went back to Maxwell House, Ktav, and ArtScroll. Right? In other words, they didn't at that point go to one of the other many Haggadot that have come out in recent years. They went back to the old school book. And as someone who cares about the aesthetic experience of a ritual and thinks it's really sort of powerful and shaping experience, that felt sad. I mean, it just, every page looks like this, like every page of text looks the same, and creates the sense that the whole Haggadah is just one long stream of undifferentiated paragraphs, which is the opposite of what it is. So I wanted to create a Haggadah that would be focused on for the people who were going back to Maxwell House, we focused on the Haggadah text and sort of conveying it, but in a way that was inviting, in a way that conveyed its structure and its contours.
Yeah, and I think it really does that. At least it certainly did for me and for our family. We had been using the Rabbinical Assembly's Feast of Freedom, which is also a lovely Haggadah. It had a little bit too much of a Holocaust focus for me, because it was created before before Yom HaShoah had really become as big of a thing as it is now, and so there was seemingly to put Holocaust into all of the rituals. But so many of the Haggadot today that are out there, have various themes, right? And you chose not to go with a particular theme, and as you just explained, but also you bring up in the commentary some contemporary ways that it could be applied, but you didn't put in any contemporary readings, and I'm curious about that. Other than Miriam's Cup. Sorry.
Right, it's true. Miriam's Cup is an anomaly in a number of ways, and it was just like it was really the only piece of non-traditional liturgy that I felt like was important enough that I really needed to include it. Other than that, and I had a few contemporary readings and a few sort of contemporary songs that were originally in it, and then as I went through the process, I realized that what I was really creating was a base Haggadah, and therefore those kind of came out. The other readings came out because I feel like there are too many different readings and things that I could have put in that I like, that I find meaningful, that other people find meaningful, and I think what each of us will need in a Haggadah will be different 3 or 5 or 10 years from now than it is right now. And I was hoping to, and I wanted this to be the kind of Haggadah that you would have a set of, that you would feel comfortable giving to everyone around the table, both your most knowledgeable and least knowledgeable participants, and that each would find it accessible, and something that would not become dated quickly, because and then people have a shelf full of different Haggadot on different themes and with different commentaries, and then you can take some of those off the shelf and have different people sort of be consulting a second book. But there is one book where I can say, you know what, we're all on page 12, and everyone can be on the same page. And even, I mean, with the transliteration, that it is that the people who aren't reading Hebrew are on the same line.
right, and could follow along with the, if they wanted, if there were parts that were singing, right, you made sure to include the transliteration, which I think also really makes it accessible. Yeah, you did some unique things in terms of some of the format of the Haggadah, and as you mentioned, not wanting it to feel like one long piece, but really breaking in. And one of the things that I really appreciated was even in the what I like to call the table of contents, the simanim, right? You break it up into 3 different colors for people to be able to see that there's an introduction, the section around the meal, right, and then I guess not really introduction, but there's the pre-meal, the meal, and the post-meal.
Well, right. So there are actually 4 colors, and in the table of contents, it's a little hard to see because the blue on that page comes out a little light. But there are 4 colors that correspond to the 4 cups. So the stuff before Magid, right, is that right? And then Magid has its own color, and then the meal and Birkat Hamazon have the third, and then Hallel and the songs at the end, right? So it's so the colors are a way to sort of divide it into sections, so it's visually easy to figure out where you are in the book, and it's also a way of it gives the book some color and variety, but having full color pages. And I talked with the artist Tilip Crown. We talked when we first met about whether it made sense to do full color drawings, and we concluded that full color drawings would. I think of the Shik Haggadah, right, which is this iconic and absolutely stunningly beautiful piece. And I did one year try to do the Seder from the Shik Haggadah, and I found it impossible, right? I couldn't, my eyes couldn't focus on the words because the illustrations were so powerful. So I wanted the illustrations to be rich, but also to sort of clearly feel like it's supporting and not dominating. And so that's why we wanted the different colors, but each section only has one color. So the drawings in Magid are all in the green of Magid.
And you mentioned in terms of the artwork, it isn't overwhelming with artwork, but there's certainly quite a bit in there. Where, as you said, it is just through some of the artwork you can tell parts of the story. One of the things I was curious about is on page 6 with Halachma Anya. It has, for people who aren't looking at it, right, it's a relief of people who are leaving on the top, and then underneath that paragraph, they're upside down, going in the opposite direction. And I was curious about that one in particular, and then any other comments you'd want to make in terms of the artwork.
So I'll say one thing about Halachma Anya. This is I'm always drawn. Maybe it's the academic part of me, but there are certain questions that people have been asking about the Haggadah and the Seder forever, right? And the classic questions, and I'm always excited when I can find something that feels not like an answer, but the answer, like the ones where you hear it and it's like, oh, actually, that's right. That actually clears it up. Halachma Anya is one of those, because most Haggadot have Halachma Anya as part of Magid, as sort of the introduction to Magid. Why does Magid have an introduction? Why wouldn't it start with the questions? Nobody has a good answer to that question. And in working on it, I figured out, I was trying to figure out like where I first where I first saw the comment that like kind of made a click in my mind that when we break the matzah for yachatz, we break the middle matzah in two. And why do we have a broken matzah at the Seder? Because the matzah is called in the Torah lechem oni, right? The bread of affliction, of suffering, of oppression. And so actually we think of yachatz doesn't have a text. Well, it does. You're supposed to break the middle matzah, hold it up, and say, this is the bread of affliction. Ha lachma anya. So that text is actually the text of breaking the matzah, and I'm like, and the people on the top and the bottom of that text is meant to kind of represent the dual identity of because here we say that the matzah is the matzah that we ate in the land of Egypt, and later we'll talk about it as the bread that we were eating as we were leaving Egypt. So that dual, right, and it's sort of like almost shifts identity in the course of the ritual. So having the people kind of going both directions was a way of kind of capturing that sense that matzah plays all these different roles, and the fact that that phrase lechem oni also connects it to the questions, because there's the midrash on that is that it's the bread over which we answer questions, right? So
that's good. Yeah, so now as you're saying that, I can see that visually it really does create a sandwich, right, with halachma anya as that middle piece.
Right.
That's great. That's great.
And sort of more broadly, it was my first experience really working intensively with an artist on my own project, right? My designer had to like sort of like reassure me about looking at her artwork and saying that's not quite right yet. I'm very much trained not to pass that kind of judgment on someone's art. But in this case, it was right. It really was my project, so it had to be kind of, and I was giving her ideas, and she was turning it into visuals. And so, one of the goals of the art is that almost every image in the book rewards a second or third look, right? Each one of them has a sort of, you can look at it and think you know what it means, right? Or what it's representing. And then if you look at it again, you go a little more closely, you'll notice something about it that has something more to say. For instance, I'm just looking at an example. I'm just going to share one image as an example. Right here for Dayenu is right this image, and you see the candlesticks, right, and you kind of see the people, right. As you look more carefully, the people are coming from between the waves, right? So they're almost like they're like streaming down the side of the pyramid, having come through the waves. And what are they going towards? Well, they're going towards the matzahs, right? So, but also towards Shabbat, towards the Ten Commandments in Har Sinai, and towards the Beit HaMikdash, which are the last six things that are mentioned in Dayenu. And because all of the other texts in the Haggadah stop at the Red Sea, stop after the Red Sea, Dayenu is really one of the only ones that includes Shabbat, Har Sinai, Israel, the Beit HaMikdash, as part of that story, and so therefore this image kind of captured that, like, the idea that of, if everything else is what they're coming from, this was an image that's meant to capture what they're going to.
Nice. And I love that it has them each on their own mountain, right? You have Mount Sinai and you have Jerusalem, each
Right, exactly.
each on a mountain there.
See, that is something that, like, the fact that that specifically the Ten Commandments and the Beit Mikdash, right, are on pyramids, right? You were exactly right, and that is something that, like, that's a fourth or fifth look kind of idea.
Yeah, I definitely did not see that last year.
Right.
When using it, but we'll be certain to point it out this year
Right.
when we get there. In a couple minutes, we'll start getting some questions. So if people do have questions you would like to ask, please do put them into the Q&A. But while I still have the floor and the opportunity, one of the things that I was curious about is that for after the third cup, right, the section that I've usually referred to as Shvo Chamatcha, right, pour out your wrath, you have the text there, of course, but you title it Welcoming Elijah and Miriam.
So, so I will here I will admit that it is titled that because we do open the door for Elijah before Shvo Chamatcha, and I didn't know what else to call it. And since I sort of was thinking of and treating sort of that and then the Eliyahu Navi and Miriam and Neviah as like one section. It kind of was the title of the section as opposed, right? So the titling was really just kind of like I defaulted to titling it to sort of referring to the opening the door for Eliyahu as opposed to figuring out how to sort of title that text. One other piece about Shvo Chamatcha specifically, well, I'm gonna there are a few Haggadot, include, I think probably a different night is the one that made this kind of like whatever the 18th century like Shvo Ahavat, like this sort of Shvo Chamatcha alternative about like pouring love on those who support us, whatever. As a kind of including that alongside it. I was never a big fan of that. Of that, it felt like a sort of insufficient, an insufficient fix to a troubling text. But I also didn't feel like I could sort of leave it leave the sort of awkwardness of it unnamed. So instead, in the comment, I cited the story of Rabbi Meir and Bruria, where Rabbi Meir wants to sort of wants God to smite these people who are harassing him, and Bruria, his wife, says, essentially, hate the sin, love the sinner, in a rabbinic idiom, and I felt like at least to offer some alternative model for thinking about confronting those who those who address us with hate, and as we have been having to do. I want to point out one more thing about that page. One of the things that's like, there were so many things that like, it's obvious to me that a good Haggadah should have, right? And I can't find one, right? We were very happy that we have an icon for when you drink each cup, and we have a separate icon, as you see. This just happens to be one of the spreads that has both of them on, so you can see, right, a separate icon for pouring the next cup. Now, I will admit that I've never had a Seder where I remembered, where I correctly remember to pour all 4 cups at the right times. And I did not break that streak last year when we were using this Haggadah. We did miss it once, but mostly it's helpful. And it's both helpful and a way to sort of like use the instructions and guidelines to sort of enrich the color as opposed to sort of just being more text.
Nice. Great. So there are some questions that I'm seeing queued up here. So let me start with some of those. One of them says, as much as the Haggadah do have within them, what should not be there, in your opinion?
What should not be in
the Haggadah, I think, is the question.
Oh, I mean, what should not be in the Haggadah that I don't like? Well, let me just say there are many different ways to screw up a perfectly good book of liturgy. Size is one. As you said, Mark, that there are so many that are that seem not to even think about what it will be like to have that book on your table. I think that the sort of activities and skits and readings are the kind of thing that they may be great for a little while, and then you've done them and you're done. They may be great to have and sort of draw from. But the years that we used a different night, had everyone using a different night, it was hard. Like people couldn't find
we had the same experience.
Page, and they couldn't find the actual Haggadah text on the page. So having something so busy and so much stuff is sort of another problem. I mean, there are shockingly few Haggadot that have more than a teeny bit of transliteration, which is I say shocking because the Seder is unique in being the only major liturgical ritual that we all lead at home, right? And we don't go to a communal space where there's somebody knowledgeable, a clergy or someone else sort of leading and guiding it. So we're doing it at home, and we have to figure out all of the pieces of sort of conducting this ritual. And it is the ritual where we are by far the most likely to have secular relatives, non-Jewish coworkers, and like people of a very wide range of knowledge levels of Jewish ritual. And so, of course, a Haggadah of any book should have transliteration, but most have very little. Those that have it, it's often down in a corner, sometimes in italics, so that to make it hard to find and hard to read for the people who don't know what's going on. But like once you think about it, it's like, well, that doesn't make sense. But it is what people do, right? And in so many, like even the books that have transliteration, nobody's taken care to think about what will make. This is one of the things that I did when I worked in the bencher. I really spent a long time, like trying different variations of how exactly to transliterate the different sounds, different letters. I wanted a system that would be consistent throughout the book, right? And it's the same system I used for this. And I showed it to 5 or 6 non-Hebrew speakers that I was friends with, and I was at JTS and doing in graduate school at the time, and figured out what was easiest for them to sort of to make sense of as people who didn't know Hebrew, so that they could feel like when we're singing a song, like if they're invited to be part of this ritual, they should feel like they can be part of it. And that means when we're singing, right? Look, when we're singing a song, half the people around my table who are reading the Hebrew also don't know what it says. Some of the songs, nobody knows what it says until they sit down. Like Vayhi Bachati Alayla, I now can tell you what every line says because I've sat with that text and gone through and looked up every biblical reference. But until I did that, I could not. So, but we all sing it together, and it's still lovely, right? So they want to be able to do that. So having a transliteration that is intuitive, um, and and easy to and what you come out with, what someone comes out with will correspond to what we're actually saying.
Yeah.
And I'll say one more thing about that. Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay.
Is the other thing is I really wanted to have a book that, like, for everyone who knows the liturgy, who's a fluent Hebrew speaker, you would open the book and it would feel like this is a traditional Haggadah. This is part of the not having the readings, right? I want you to open it and say, oh, this is a Haggadah made for me. But also that those non-Jewish guests at your Seder can open the same book and feel like, oh, this is a text that I can access, I can make sense of. This is a Haggadah meant for me, because that is the book that you'll feel you can hand to everyone at the table. That's the way that everyone can be in the same book.
Yeah, which is precisely why I ordered it for our synagogue Seder. One more question for me, and then I'll get back. Did you consider doing a 3-ring binder type of thing, or something that would allow for inserts?
So no. A 3-ring binder is
expensive.
Well, it's expensive, and it is a different kind of thing. I do have, and I have this. Right, it's coming a spiral version, and the spiral version was because of a sort of a suggestion by someone in a session that I was leading a couple of years ago about the Haggadah at Beth El in Highland Park in Chicago, and I was like, sure, I'll try it. And then when it came, I was like, oh my God, like it was an afterthought, but like it opens up and it lies flat on the table. You don't have to wedge it under a dish.
Right.
You can fold it back, right? And it can be like, it's so right, and it will literally fit between the two plates on the table. So with our second printing, we printed a lot more of them. We made a lot more of them with spiral binding, because there are a lot of people who like, that's actually been one of the most well-received pieces of it. And, despite all the work that I did on the content and the art and everything, right, the spiral binding is like,
yeah, no, it's brilliant. Can we trade in? No, just kidding. So a question: were you tempted to give more recognition to Moses in the Haggadah?
No. And the reason is that the idea that of Moshe not being mentioned in the Haggadah is often talked about in the way that we talk about God's name not appearing in Esther. God's name does not appear in the book of Esther, and it's clearly intentional, and it's clearly saying something, right? And it's saying something about the hiddenness of God's presence in the diaspora, and et cetera, et cetera. Here, the reason Moshe is not mentioned in Magid, he does get at least one mention in Hallel, right? His name does show up, as does Aaron's name, right? And other characters in the story. But in Magid, he's not mentioned because the mitzvah of the Higadata Levincha, right, of telling your children, is not about narrating the story in all its detail. We get that from that story of the 5 rabbis, but the rest of the Haggadah isn't written to sort of fit that framework. What you're supposed to tell your children is we were suffering and oppressed. God heard our cry and came and saved us with great might. And therefore, we owe this deep debt of gratitude and to God and loyalty. And we have this sort of deep and permanent connection with God. That's the message of the Seder. So each of the, right, after the four questions, the page after the four questions, page 8, I think, is titled "The Four Answers." Partially to dispel the notion, the sort of very common notion that, like, well, we ask questions and we never give the answers. It's not true. We answer a different question, because fundamentally the question is, why do we do this Seder ritual? And it's and the answer in the Torah and for the rabbis was to remember that we were in need and God came to our rescue. So the Avadim Hayinu does exactly that. Right? We were slaves. God brought us out, and if God had not brought us out, the people of Israel would not have come into being. We would not be Israel. We would not be Bnei Israel. There wouldn't be no such thing. Right? The second answer: God brought Abraham from his world of idolatry, brought Abraham close. Abraham's grandchildren were forced back into exile, right, and back in and sort of and alienated again, and God again brought them close. And right, throughout history, each time Bnei Israel are in a time of hardship, oppression, under attack, right, God doesn't shield us from those, but God is with us through those hardships, and ultimately the promises sees us through. But again, it's a story of of Bnei Israel facing oppression and hardship, and God coming to our aid. And in that story, Moshe's role is actually almost beside the point.
Thanks. There is a question on whether you considered including musical notes for the songs.
So, bars of sheet music are not an effective. I have found are not an effective thing to put in a book like this, especially if you're concerned with size, because a very small percentage of the people who are going to be using it can read the music on the fly, right? That's actually a fairly high level of musical skill. And any text, like, there are many different melodies. So how would I pick one? And it's that if you're preparing for the Seder, you don't need sheet music in the book, because you can find so many better resources online. I mean, I know I have friends who have sort of put together their own Haggadot and ventures and stuff, and put in the sort of sheet music for the melody, because they're musicians and that was important to them. And this gets back to the sort of what I said at the beginning, which is I didn't come into this with here are the things I need to put into a Haggadah. I was really thinking about all those people who are using Maxwell Hauser Art Scroll because they can't find anything better that focuses on the Haggadah, and it's like, what do those people need to be using? And I found that, like, the answer to that was fairly consistent.
Yeah. I would say perhaps an idea for a future would be a leader's guide to put online, where you could include some of those resources and
right. So
maybe some explanations about some of the artwork, and that may help for people who are using it to lead a Seder.
Yeah, so I was actually literally sort of had a conversation about exactly that at our Kodesh de Shabbos. Someone was really sort of sort of making a case for making sort of explanations of the artwork available. And it's one of those like things like, well, I don't have time for before this Pesach, but it's certainly something that I'm chewing on for next year.
Yeah. A question on how do you reconcile pour out your wrath, especially these days?
There's a move that sort of more liberal Judaic scholars sometimes make that I tend to resist, but sort of but with this text it's kind of hard not to, of like explaining where that sort of explaining the context in which that text and that way of talking about non-Jews made sense experientially, theologically, and kind of saying, and not saying that's not really what Judaism says, because I don't think there's any one Judaism says. It's one of those sentences that we use way too often, as if there's a singular answer to any of those questions. But at least offering sort of offering an alternative was what I felt was the best thing I could do. I mean, look, there is a the Nevi'im, the prophets have this idea that our ultimate redemption and elevation will of necessity involve the downfall of our enemies. And in the Middle Ages, that was a very attractive, right? And it was a violent world, and it was a very attractive idea. And honestly, part of what's so hard about it is precisely that there's so many in our community today who actually are talking exactly in that way, right? It's yes. Like if that was a simply an outdated way of talking or thinking, I mean, like Amalek, right? The idea of destroying a whole nation, right? Because of past sins. I don't have trouble talking about Amalek because that feels like an idea from the ancient world. Certainly, I don't feel like that's something that like is current, but like the idea that like there are enemies, like we should we should rain destruction down upon them, with like that is a very real. I've read things that I would that a group with Shvo Hamatcha 3 times this week, literally. Yeah. So I struggle with that one more.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add in an opinion if I may, just in thinking about that text. One of the things for me is that it is not saying that we should do it, right? It's like the text about vengeance in Torah, right? We ask God to be the vengeance, right? Is a way of saying we are not going to be that, right? We're asking God to pour out the wrath, right? And again, it doesn't make it not troubling, but I also think that there is, I agree with you 100% in terms of how it is being used and the very troublesome nature. But I also think that there is a piece that, for liberals like me, right, who want to think of, the world, should all be wonderful, right? There is a price, right, for freedom. There is a price for us to be able to have a state of Israel, and even if we are doing our best, or even when we are doing our best to minimize that price, there is going to be a death. And we see that with the death of the firstborn, right? We have to deal with it, the crossing of the sea, and the Egyptian soldiers dying. So I think one of the things it does for me is helped me to be able to sort of wrestle with that aspect, that freedom, as they like to say, isn't free, right? There are costs, and sometimes those costs fall on others. And again, the language of it is much harsher than that. And I'm not going to sugarcoat that, but I do think that it opens up that conversation about some of those challenges.
I would share one other thing. I mean, this was all sort of put together sort of before October 7th, before all of the and all of the events the last year and a half, and certainly it's specifically meant not to be tied to a particular moment in time, but in a sort of, but there one piece where I felt like I had to make a statement was in this piece of art here. This is kind of the most significant piece in the book in terms of the art, and because I felt like I come every year to sort of, and we like the plagues are there are toys and like it's and then we throw things around the table and like have little bugs and put the bugs on people who don't like them and plagues of the sort of like of the natural world going haywire is terrifying. And it should feel terrifying, and it should feel, and I feel like it should feel like it may have been necessary, but it was a heavy price to pay. And the way I wanted to illustrate that, and this is one. There were pieces of art where Tilla and I went back and forth, and to kind of find, this was one where she showed me something, and I was like, I love it. Don't change it. That the ancient plagues come from the top, from God, right? But then these are the modern plagues that essentially we're bringing on ourselves. And
the factories and the pollution,
and the flooding and the forest fires, right, like, because sort of talking about plagues like should like bring an awareness of that, like that it may be necessary, but it's at least we need to feel the pain of the cost. And I think that something similar can be said of facing the choices, the sort of like no-win choices that we face today.
I also, by the way, love the fact that on a very different note, the next page that you title "Math Games," because it so captures, sort of that there is a lightheartedness aspect of what's going on there, and the rabbis being, sort of playful and
it's funny because this is one of the things that I showed the text to like various people over the course of the time I was working on it. This is one that got strong reactions from colleagues in one direction or the other. It's right. It sometimes feels like people treat it as slightly heretical to sort of suggest that not every part of Torah is equally weighty and serious, or equally sort of laden with meaning. But in fact, honestly, like the Haggadah is a fairly long text, and there's a certain amount of reciting and sort of like performing a ritual, right? Because we call liturgical rituals service because it's a way of serving and showing and giving honor and showing devotion, right? But when we're mining the text for meaning, there are parts that are more meaningful than others, and if we don't recognize that, then we get stuck on. We get stuck on whatever the first things are, and then by the time we get to the like rich, right? And by the time we get to Bechol Dor Vador and the beginning of Hallel, which are supposed to be the emotional kind of pinnacle of this ritual, everyone's already getting hungry and like looking at their watches, and somebody from the kitchen is got something stuck in their throat and is coughing loudly. Uh, so I think it's and I will say that like it's also part of just breaking up the sense that it's one unbroken chain of identical texts, right? Some certain texts are like defining and are highlighted, and certain texts are playful, and certain texts are in there as digressions. And all of that is part of the fun of it. I mean, and Haggadah is not about anything relevant. It's just fun.
By the way, one of the things that in terms of differentiating, one of the things I didn't notice again, first time use was that in the introduction you include the Seder length, the sort of a core elements piece of it for people who might not have people at their table who are able to sit through the whole thing. So
right. That is another thing that like a few colleagues like raised their eyebrows out, and other people were like, "Well, that's great." I think I could include it because it was post-COVID, because everyone shared
right.
little guide things like that during COVID when we were like trying to do Zoom or and we had to like we were all abbreviating everything in the first Pesach of COVID was like a month in. We were still learning how to use Zoom. But I think actually it's important in the same way that I made a point in my bencher of including a short form of benching, and in the introduction to the short form of benching is not explaining like essentially that the introduction to it is an argument for why it's totally fine halachically to recite the short form, so that if it'll be more meaningful to you to recite this shorter text, right, then you should do that, and you should not feel second rate about it. And honestly, when it comes to the Seder, I'm a little bit of a skipper. I don't mean to shock anyone or puzzle my book, but I want to spend time on the things that are really central, and there are things that I find like I find less engaging, and I will be selective.
Right. Because it's about telling the story, right? And it's about engaging people in the story.
Yeah.
There's a question here from somebody who had been to a Seder where they opened the door for Elijah much earlier as guests are arriving, and wondering if you've seen that in any Haggadot.
I have not. I'm that is totally new to me. I'd be interested if there's a source for that.
Yeah. So this person thinks that it felt like it worked well in terms of creating that welcoming, open atmosphere.
One interesting thing that where placement was a real question was actually at the end. Like when you started the question, I thought this is where I thought you were going. It turns out that if you look across Haggadot, Nirtza appears in either before the song, the songs at the end, or after the songs at the end. But in the couple of Haggadot that have been over the years have been most widely used, it appears before the songs. But in the Feast of Freedom, which I grew up using, the Rabbinical Assembly Haggadah, it appears at the end after the songs, and that's always felt right to me. And it feels right to me because I guess the argument that I've gotten from people is, well, then what part of the Seder are the songs? What are the songs in? And I'm like, well, that's just a mnemonic. They don't have to be part of a section, right? Because Nirtza is the clothing. And for me, like Lashana Haba Yerushalayim is are the words with which you get up from the table, right? Like, so whatever you're going to do, and it very intentionally parallels the end of Ne'ilah and Yom Kippur, where again, Lashon Haba Yerushalayim is the very last thing you say in Yom Kippur. So, so I actually had a few friends who used the beta edition who briefly had convinced me to move it to before the songs. And then I just kept looking at him like, that doesn't feel right. So I put a note before the song saying some people say Nirtza here, but I put it at the end where I felt it belonged.
Sorry for my moving around here a little bit. I just saw that my computer, which I thought was plugged in, is not. And I don't want it to die. There we go. So there were questions with the plagues. One is there's a question of why not just list some of those modern plagues instead of just having it, I guess, depicted through the artwork. And then there's also a question of translation, not specific to plagues, but just the choice of using Sea of Reeds versus Red Sea.
So in terms of the plagues, I will say that in terms of the plagues, I think that listing them would kind of fall into sort of into the realm with like the contemporary readings. It's like in a slightly different kind of Haggadah I might have, but I was really sort of trying to. I was really focused on making the traditional liturgy comprehensible and sort of accessible. Right, most of the commentary is about giving you a feel for how each individual piece fits into the whole, connects to the things before, the things after it, how sort of why it is where it is. In the commentary, I talk about, right. I talk about the. I mean, the idea that of sort of facing of what it means to sort of talk about this facing modern plagues. Listing them would have felt awkward, whereas depicting them feels like something between, like, when in the art, when people, because you don't see it at first, because you look at it assuming that you're going to see it's a full page piece of art, assuming that you're going to see a depiction of the ancient plagues, and you do see that. It's only the second, third, fourth time that you look at it that you notice that the stuff on the bottom isn't kind of just like the detritus of the ancient, but it's actually something else. And then there, when you connect it to the brief comment at the bottom of the page, right, and you understand kind of the fuller picture, and that actually makes it much more sort of striking. And I have been told by a number of people that kind of that like, oh, wait, that's what's going on here. Makes the kind of the idea behind it sort of much more powerful.
Yeah.
And
right, so there's the discovery aspect of it, and that sort of, as opposed to hammering people over the head.
Right, and because if I was listing, I would feel like some need some obligation to completeness, like as if I could give a complete list of the sort of like ways that we have we've deformed the natural world in our time. Like, whereas in a piece of art, there's no sense that it needs to sort of to mention sort of like mention everything. It is.
And in terms of Sea of Reeds versus Red Sea?
Um, I just tried to, I tried to be as precise as I could, um, and uh, um, and uh, that was one where I didn't. It actually wasn't so important to me. With a more interesting translation question was Arami Oved Avi, which
Mhm.
in the sort of literal sense, right, the general understanding is that it means an Aramean Lavan was trying to, tried to kill my father. But obviously in the Midrash, it is reread to be my father was what was himself a wandering, lost Aramean. And there I was uh, undecided for a while about which translation to put in the sort of in translating the verse itself. I ended up going with what I thought was the literal translation, even though then the first line of the midrash then offers the other reading, or maybe even because the first line of the midrash offers the other reading.
Mm. Yeah, nice. Um, Somebody asked if there are activities that you find to be particularly meaningful additions.
I mean, activities that I find to be pretty meaningful additions to a seder. Um, so I would say, I mean, I have my own favorite stable of Seder activities, and many people have sort of different versions of it. My kids will be the first to volunteer that I'm not necessarily the world's expert in activities. Uh, I will say that so I will mention a couple things that I was thinking about specifically in the context of this book. One is I the commentary, every comment, other than like those few full page section introductions, every comment is meant to be. You can read it in the time that it takes people to read the text on that page. Right? It's not something you
Mhm.
need to. This is not a preparation the week before Haggadah. This is you can read the comments while people are on that page. And I invite people at my table, like, don't be embarrassed, like, oh, I don't want him to know that I'm like reading the stuff on the side while we're supposed to be reading the text. No, like if you're reading the comment, great. If there's something that you didn't know or that's surprising or that is that makes you think of something say, oh, like the comment has this idea, and that's a really interesting perspective, and here's why. For the teenagers especially, uh, I like and really invited them to, like, I challenged them to look for hidden messages in the art because I know that they're there. But now I'm telling all of you that they're there. So, and when they notice something there that's maybe not obvious, let us know. Like to say to the kids, like, we haven't found them all. When you find one, like it's a treasure hunt right there in the book,
Mm.
without having to feel like a kid's book, right?
Right. The hidden
And
Mickeys.
I will say one other thing, which is one of the things that I have right I for a bunch of years I live in an apartment, so they sort of the space for kids running around during the Seder is somewhat limited. But I have done like a scavenger hunt, um, where I give like 6 clues to different places around the apartment, and in each place, right, when they figure out the clue, they find a bananagram tile, and once they have all 6 or 7 bananagram tiles, those can then be unscrambled to tell them where I hid the afikoman.
I
So,
like that.
and the scavenger hunt clues are all Seder related clues. Sometimes they're like, and there's actually one year when I made a particularly um, challenging scavenger hunt, and I made up the rule on the spot that that the kids were allowed to ask anyone who didn't live in our apartment for help, right? And we actually had uh, a young couple here who they're now one is a now professor at JTS, and the other teaches it. Is also an academic, but like and so my son was like went over to them, and they were like, and they got really into like solving the riddles. Um, that's actually been it's an idea that I got from escape rooms actually.
Mhm.
And because escape rooms are doing the same thing, they're trying to maximize the amount of creative, the amount of sort of creative exploring that you can do within a very sort of limited space.
And the theme of escape, of course,
Right. And theme of escape.
works
Sure.
very nicely. Um, can you talk a little bit about in terms of the egalitarian and gender and how you dealt with those types of issues?
Yeah. I my father, I sort of first got into sort of liturgy publishing because my father was the editor of the two Sim Shalom volumes, the sort of the second generation Sim Shalom. And I worked with him on it and sort of watched him going through that process. And his guiding principle was his translations were gender egalitarian up to the point where they would no longer sound like English. Right? It was more important to him that the texts read in English as like coherent, meaningful texts that write. Uh, and so I was, there are actually a couple of places where in the first printing, uh, I sort of I did a couple of things that then people suggested a different way of phrasing it that solved a problem. Um, so it is pretty much throughout very carefully sort of gender neutral, with a very few exceptions. Um, and the fact that the only sort of extra liturgical text that I included was about Miriam. Um, but I but what I didn't want was, and um, I don't have it here, but I didn't want a book that I didn't want to sort of label it as an egalitarian Haggadah. First of all, because certainly for my own kids and for egalitarian should be given, and not something you have to be like, oh, this one's egalitarian. But also because, frankly, um, if I don't, and this has been true, like when my venture came out, I approached the rabbinical assembly about because my father had done this worked on the Sidurim through the RA. I approached them about um, publishing the venture. They were not interested, but I'm actually so glad it worked out that way because it's not identified in that way.
Yeah.
There are lots of people, conservative, reform, Orthodox, who want a venture with all of those songs, with the transliteration and the right and the right, the fact that it says when three adults have eaten together and not when three men have eaten together, right?
Yeah.
If you're not looking for that, you don't. It doesn't bother you. And so if I'm not sort of pointing it out, then I can produce something that is carefully and thoughtfully egalitarian, and also make it and also reach sort of and sort of a part of the community that might otherwise be suspicious. I will say I did
I by the way, the first time I encountered the Yedid Nefesh venture was at an Orthodox wedding. So
see,
that seemed to have worked.
right. And if you don't know who I am, right, then you wouldn't know until you started looking through and found the specific places where that comes through. I did a presentation about the Haggadah a few weeks ago at the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale, which is a modern Orthodox synagogue in my neighborhood, and it was a great session. It was like a lot of great discussion. As people were leaving, there's one of the members of the shul who was a brilliant guy who, the kind of guy who notices absolutely everything. So I was not surprised, and I was not surprised when he came up to me and was like, you didn't say anything about Miriam. and I said to him, well, nobody asked about Miriam. And the truth is that I was certainly prepared and would have been happy to talk about it with them, but I don't know that crowd well enough to know whether the inclusion of Miriam would be something they're interested in and excited about, or something that would be off-putting. So I didn't feel the need to sort of draw attention to it. I would not have shied away from it if they had asked about it. But and I'll say one other thing about Miriam. Rabbi Leila Goldberner, who wrote it, who wrote the Miriam and Neviah sort of parallel to Eliyahu Nevi. I have it in the bencher as sort of in Havdalah, sort of when we sing Eliyahu Nevi, but it really belongs here because it's here that the parallel between Eliyahu and Eliyahu's wine glass and Miriam's water glass is really powerful. And it's one right. It's one of the places where I had this. I had something clear in my that I wanted the art to convey, and I was like, but I have no idea how to do that. And then my brilliant artist crafted this thing, right? If you look at this piece, right, you have the bucket from Miriam's well, with Eliyahu's wine cup embedded in it, and what's pouring out is the color of wine, but being poured into water, right? So an image that really merges and sort of merges the images of Miriam and Eliyahu, and really tries to get at there being those two cups being two sides of two aspects to the leadership required to reach redemption. So it's also the reason that it's not Miriam is there not only because as sort of an egalitarian pairing for Eliyahu, but because the pairing of Eliyahu and Miriam, and specifically of those cups, actually enriches that whole moment of the Seder.
So that's one of the places where you suggest a certain way of doing, of everybody taking from their cups and pouring in. Going back to the idea of activities, there are certain communities that have traditions, you beating each other with leeks and things like that. I'm curious if you thought about including any of that, and if so, why you chose not to.
There are places where there are places where I include a reference to different minhagim. I didn't mostly. I wasn't mostly trying to be to sort of record the range of different minhagim. I think that in the I think after my experience has been, and this is subjective, but my experience has been just in talking to people that that some of the pieces after the meal are people are either less familiar with, or sort of less focused on, and therefore don't have as much of a sense of here's how we do this. So I think in a few of the places after the meal, I specifically sort of give a little more concrete sort of guidance or suggestions about ways of doing things than I do in the first part.
One of our somebody who's on notes that actually going back to an earlier question, that the Bronfman Haggadah does have the Eliyahu piece at the beginning.
Oh, really?
Just to note.
The Bronfman, I will look at it. Thank you.
And then similar in terms of instruction-wise, there's a question: does your Haggadah instruct people to hide the afikomen, or does it assign a person to safeguard it?
But
a recipe goes missing.
So I would say, I guess people have the PDF of this, so you can kind of like I don't there are so many different ways to ideas of what to do with the afikomen. I would far be it from me to suggest one particular way. Although now that you mention it, I'm actually actually have to go and check. Like, what did I actually say at Yachatz about
I think that you said for the leader to hide it, but I don't remember.
No, I said it should be set aside until the end of the meal. I didn't do anything beyond that. When you get to Tzafun, they're sort of, that's one of the places where I sort of I tried to kind of channel a little bit of the fun and silliness that that we associate with the afikomen and searching for the afikomen and the presence of the afikomen and whatnot. So on page 45, if you're looking at the, you can kind of flip through in the PDF, right? It was one of the this is one of the places where I let myself be a little tongue in cheek about that moment of the ritual, because it's both because it's like its placement, like the idea of like eating this dry matzah and that being the last thing we eat at the meal is the result of this kind of like cascade of sort of misinterpretations and reinterpretations of a couple of texts. And it's kind of odd, like that, like, oh, the last taste you should have at this great ritual is matzah. And because like that, like if you've gotten the kids this far and they're like actually bringing the afikomen back at the time that you're doing the afikomen, you've done a great job, right? Like, how many years have we like had to kind of pause in the middle of the meal to like do the afikomen and give an afikomen present, right? Because kids are ready to go to bed. So if if your kids are still running around wired on grape juice and sort of like ready to bark, sort of bring back the afikomen, like at this point, like you deserve a little levity.
All right, and I think that this is our last question. Somebody noted that when you were speaking at Or Kodesh, you were talking specifically about Dayenu. Is there anything that you want to share here from that?
Oh, sure. Okay, I'll give you I'll try to give you the 2-sentence version of it. There's a Psalm 78, and I'll go and sort of read up on it after. That actually sort of it declares like, behold, I'm about to fulfill the mitzvah of V'higadat Levincha, right? And here's how, right? It's like a psalm that actually says, I'm now going to model for you how and why one is supposed to do this mitzvah. It's like a remarkable moment of like intra-biblical sort of interpretation. And then it goes on to say that like we have to sort of to share with our parents shared with us, and we have to share with our children memory of all the things that God did for us, because it goes on to say, God forbid our children should turn out to be a bunch of no goodniks like the Israelites in the desert. Because the Israelites in the desert, God sort of split the sea for them and drowned their enemies, and then they complained. God gave them water, and they whined. But they brought them food, and over and over and over again, God was stuck with them, and they were continually rebelled, and and we want to raise good little tzaddikim who will learn from the error of their ways and not make same mistakes. So Dayenu is actually is very directly sort of modeled on. It's very directly an inversion. So Dayenu doesn't actually mean it would have been enough for us. Like if you brought us out into the desert and then left us there, we would have been fine with that. We would have been a-okay. It means that one thing, like if you'd only done this one thing, that would have been sufficient to demonstrate your greatness and your love, and to merit our faith and loyalty. So you can almost read it as a when. Like when God had drowned our enemies, but not yet given us water in the desert, that was enough for us to stay loyal and faithful and trust in God, right? Not what the Israelites did, right? When God had given us the water and manna, but had not yet in that intervening time when he'd not yet given us Shabbat and Torah, right? That was enough. We declare now, right, in a sort of rewriting of history, like that was enough. That those gifts were sufficiently great to merit our loyalty and devotion and trust. And so we are.
And I've also heard and would warrant the saying of Hallel, right, which connects.
And would each of them, right? So it's both sort of repairing the sort of the failure of trust of the original Israelites, and an exercise in sort of like individually appreciating and acknowledging each, right? It's a problem when you on a birthday, when you get lots of presents and you're opening different presents, and this present gets a second, and then the next one is bigger, and so you're like, the person who gave you this present is basically in the dust. Is an exercise in identifying and recognizing each act, and the Dayenu really frames them as acts of kindness and love. It's much more important that they show God's love than that they show God's might. And recognizing each one and saying each one is itself deserving of our love in return. And in that frame, it is in some ways like a capstone statement of the message of the Haggadah, especially when you think about the Hisha Amda, where inherent in God's promise is that each redemption is partial, right? That there will be a partial redemption, and then there will be further hardships, and there will be another partial redemption, right? That the promise is not to keep us free of hardship; it is to be with us through hardship and ultimately bring us through it, right? So precisely in the desert, like it's those in between times when things feel bleak, that sense of trust, love, loyalty was most needed, right? And today too, like it's been the moments that in the times that feel like things are unraveling, that we need that sense of trust that God is going through it with us and will ultimately, in ways that maybe we can't yet see, bring us through.
Well, that's a perfect place for us to end. And I want to thank you so much, both on a personal level, because you just gave me so much more material to be able to use for our communal Seder, but also for sharing all of this with everybody here. And I will turn it back to Matt.
Thank you so much. It's
Yes.
really an honor. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. So I wanted to just reiterate what Rabbi Israel just said, and just thank you, Rabbi Cahan, and thank you, Rabbi Israel, for tackling these questions and sharing your wisdom. And I imagine everybody out there has so much to gain for their Seder, and hopefully, if those of you that are interested in purchasing the Haggadah, it's really, as we've seen, an amazing text that we've sent the link, and we can provide it also in our follow-up materials. So thank you both again, and
I,
hope.
I should say that there's a message from my from Joe Gellis, my distributor, that any orders that he's gotten before Wednesday morning will definitely reach you before Seder. So although the sooner the better, because it's a busy time, but lest anyone feel like it's too late to order again.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, there's still tonight in a couple of days. So so I just want to say, Chag Sameach to you all. Have a wonderful holiday, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. Take care.
Chag Sameach, everyone.